The air inside the government building felt dry and heavy. The kind of place where people waited for hours only to hear they had filled out the wrong form. Behind the counter, a young clerk tapped lazily on her keyboard. Her eyes fixed more on her phone than the people in line. The ticking clock on the wall was the loudest sound in the room. At the end of the line stood an old man with trembling hands and a calm face. That carried years of discipline. His name was Robert Hayes. His gray hair was neatly combed, and his clothes were clean though worn. On his chest, he still wore his faded army jacket. The green fabric had lost its color, and the old patches were barely readable. But to him, that jacket wasn't just clothing. It was his story, his honor. And his last piece of pride. Robert had been a soldier for most of his life. He had served his country faithfully into long wars overseas, leading men through dangerous missions. But now, after all those years, he lived alone in a small rented house at the edge of town. His wife, Margaret, had passed away last winter after a long illness. Her last words to him were gentle but full of strength. "Don't give up, Rob. You've given enough to this country. Let it give something back to you." So that morning, holding the same folder he had carried for decades, Robert took a slow bus ride into the city. The folder contained his discharge papers, medals, and letters from his commanders. It was proof of his service, his sacrifice, and his dedication. He wasn't asking for charity. He was asking for what he had earned, his veteran's pension. When his turn finally came, he stepped forward with a polite smile. "Good morning, miss," he said softly, placing his folder on the counter. "I'm here to check on my veteran's pension application." The clerk looked up briefly, scanning him with indifferent eyes. She typed something into her computer, sighed loudly, and frowned. "Name?" "Robert Hayes," he answered. She clicked through more screens, her face tightening with impatience. After a few minutes, she said flatly, "I'm sorry, sir, but it seems your case doesn't meet the current requirements." Robert blinked, surprised. "Ma'am, I served 22 years. I have everything here, my service records, my commander's signatures, everything." She shrugged, clearly uninterested. "Yes, but the regulations have changed. You'll have to reapply using the new system. It's all online now." He looked at her quietly. "Online?" he repeated. "I don't have a computer. I thought this office still processed applications." "We don't anymore," she said, tapping her nails on the counter. "You'll need to create an account on the portal, upload all your documents again, and wait for approval. It can take several months." Robert's eyes lowered. "Miss, I don't even know how to do that. I don't have anyone to help me." The clerk shrugged again. "Then maybe you should find someone who does." She handed his folder back and turned to call the next person in line. Robert stood there for a moment, unsure what to say. People in the waiting area shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away, pretending not to hear. The old man finally gathered his papers, nodded politely, and whispered, "Thank you anyway." He turned and walked slowly toward the door. Each step felt heavier than the last. His wife's words echoed in his mind, "Don't give up." But right now, it felt impossible not to. He stepped outside into the chilly morning air and sat down on a wooden bench near the building. His hands trembled as he opened the folder and stared at the yellowed papers inside. His medals lay beside them, dull but precious. He traced his finger over a picture of his wife tucked into the corner. She was smiling, the way she always did before he left for deployment. He had promised her he would never let the world make him bitter. But at that moment, sitting in the cold, forgotten by the same system he had once fought to protect, the sadness inside him grew heavier. A janitor sweeping near the door had watched the entire exchange. His name was Mike, a quiet man in his 40s who worked there for years. He noticed the way Robert's shoulders slumped as he left, the way the clerk rolled her eyes afterward. It wasn't the first time he had seen a veteran turned away like that. But this time, something about the old man's calm dignity struck him deeply. Mike leaned his broom against the wall, pulled out his small phone, and stepped into the hallway. He scrolled through his contacts and found a number he rarely used. After a deep breath, he pressed call. The line rang once before a stern voice answered. "This is General Dalton, sir," Mike said quickly, keeping his voice low. Forgive me for calling. But I think you should know. They just denied Sergeant Hayes' pension again. The same man you mentioned years ago, Robert Hayes, from the 3rd Infantry." There was silence on the line for a few seconds. Then the voice came back, steady and firm. "Are you certain?" "Yes, sir. I saw it myself. He's sitting outside the building right now. They told him his papers are too old." There was another pause. Then the general's voice changed, sharper, colder. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. Mike nodded silently. "Yes, sir." He hung up the phone, placed it back in his pocket, and went back to sweeping. But now his hands moved faster. There was something powerful in the air, the feeling that justice was coming. Meanwhile, Robert sat quietly on the bench, watching cars pass by. Every now and then, people came out of the building carrying papers and folders, talking on their phones, rushing off to their busy lives. No one looked at him twice. He felt invisible, like a man whose story had ended long ago. He thought about his friends who never made it home, the ones he still saw in his dreams. He thought about his wife's voice, her laughter, her faith in him. "You always keep your promises, Rob," she used to say. But right now, he felt like he had broken one. He reached into his pocket and took out a small coin, his unit's challenge coin. It had been given to him after a mission that almost took his life. The edges were worn, the surface scratched, but it reminded him of who he once was, strong, capable, respected. He turned it over in his palm slowly, then put it back inside. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain. He didn't have an umbrella, but he didn't move. He didn't have anywhere else to go anyway. Inside, the clerk was laughing softly with another coworker, telling her how stubborn these old guys could be. She didn't notice the janitor looking at her from across the room with disappointment in his eyes. He wanted to say something, but he held it in. He knew that soon he wouldn't have to. Minutes passed. The clock inside the office ticked past 11. The sky outside turned gray, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Robert pulled his jacket tighter, shielding his folder from the water. He didn't care about getting wet. He only cared about protecting those papers. Then, down the street, a black SUV approached. It stopped right in front of the building. The driver stepped out quickly and opened the back door. A tall man in a crisp military uniform stepped out, his face stern, his walk commanding. His chest carried rows of medals, his shoulders squared like someone still on duty. It was General Mark Dalton. He was known throughout the armed forces as a man who never forgot those who served under him or before him. He had spent decades in the military and had seen the best and worst of people. But nothing angered him more than seeing veterans treated unfairly. As he entered the building, the room fell silent. People turned their heads immediately, sensing his authority. The clerk looked up, startled, unsure who he was at first. But when she saw the stars on his uniform, her breath caught. Without saying a word, he walked straight past the line and stood at the counter. The sound of his boots echoed through the room. His presence alone felt like a storm entering the building. Outside, Robert noticed the commotion through the glass door. He didn't recognize the man at first, but something about the uniform made his heart beat faster. He stood up slowly, curious. Inside, the general's voice finally broke the silence. "I'm looking for the person who processed this application," he said, placing a folder, the same one Robert had carried, on the counter. "Robert Hayes, former sergeant of the 3rd Infantry Division." The clerk swallowed hard. "I did, sir. I was just following procedure." The general's eyes narrowed slightly. "Procedure?" he repeated quietly. People nearby froze. Even the janitor stopped sweeping. The general opened the folder, looked down at the papers, and then lifted his gaze again. "You denied this man's pension because of a form. A man who served this country for 22 years, who led soldiers through fire, who gave everything he had, and you sent him away with nothing but an online link." The clerk tried to speak but couldn't. Her voice caught in her throat. The general's expression softened slightly as he closed the folder and looked toward the door, where the old man now stood watching from outside. "Bring him in," he said quietly. Mike. The janitor hurried to open the door and called out, "Sir, please come in." Robert hesitated. confused, then slowly stepped inside, still holding his folder close. Everyone in the office turned to look at him. The quiet old man who had been ignored just minutes before now stood at the center of attention. He didn't know who the officer was, but the look in the man's eyes told him he wasn't there for anger. He was there for justice. The general nodded to him respectfully. "Sergeant Hayes," he said, his voice deep and calm, "I'm sorry you had to go through this, but I promise you, things are about to change." Robert blinked, unsure what to say. He simply nodded. The old soldier. The entire office had gone silent. No one moved, no one whispered. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed to stop. The young clerk stood stiff behind the counter, her face pale as she watched the tall man in the decorated uniform look around the room. General Mark Dalton's presence filled every corner. He wasn't shouting, but his calm, steady authority was enough to make everyone straighten up. Robert Hayes stood near the doorway, clutching his worn folder against his chest. He looked unsure if he should stay or leave, but the janitor gave him a small nod of reassurance. Slowly, Robert stepped closer, his old boots making quiet sounds on the tile floor. His jacket was still damp from the rain outside. The edges of his papers were slightly wet, but he didn't seem to care. General Dalton turned toward him. His eyes softened instantly, his voice lowering as he said, "Sergeant Hayes, sir, please come here." Robert blinked. "Sir, yes, you," the general replied gently. "You've waited long enough." Everyone in the room watched as the old man walked up to the counter. The general reached out, took the folder from his hands, and opened it carefully, as if it were something sacred. He flipped through the yellowed pages, reading the service records and old signatures. The name Robert Hayes appeared again and again, attached to awards, commendations, and letters from superior officers. The general's jaw tightened slightly as he turned one page after another. Finally, he closed the folder and looked straight at the clerk. "You denied this man's pension," he said quietly. "Do you even know who he is?" The clerk swallowed hard. "I was just following the process, sir. The system said his documents were outdated." The system? The general's tone didn't rise, but the weight in his voice grew heavier. "The system doesn't bleed. The system doesn't march for 20 miles with no sleep. The system doesn't lose friends in the field. Men like him kept that system alive so that you could sit here and type on that computer." The clerk lowered her eyes, guilt written all over her face. The other people in line nodded slightly. Some were even recording quietly, knowing they were witnessing something that mattered. The general turned toward the old man beside him. "Sergeant Hayes, when did you serve?" Robert straightened slightly. 1969 to 1991, sir," he said softly. "3rd Infantry Division. Retired after the 2nd deployment." The general gave a slow nod. "My father served in that division," he said, his voice quieter now. He used to talk about a man who saved his entire unit when they were trapped behind enemy lines. He said the man never asked for recognition, just made sure his men got home alive. That man's name was Robert Hayes. Robert's eyes widened. "Your father?" he whispered. "Yes," the general said. "My father was Lieutenant James Dalton. He told me if I ever met Sergeant Hayes, I should shake his hand and thank him for giving him a second chance at life." For a long moment, the two men stood in silence. The old veteran's hands trembled slightly. Then, slowly, the general reached out and shook his hand firmly. "Sir," the general said softly, "I owe you my family's life." Robert blinked hard, struggling to find words. His voice came out rough and quiet. "I just did what any man would have done for his brothers, sir." The general smiled faintly. "You did more than that." He turned to the clerk again, his tone changing back to command. "Now listen carefully. You are going to process this man's pension right now. I don't care how many systems you have to log into, what forms you need to download, or who you have to call. This man's record will be approved before he walks out that door." "Yes, sir," the clerk said quickly, her voice shaking. She began typing furiously, her hands trembling over the keyboard. The general pulled a chair for Robert. "Sit down, Sergeant. You stood long enough in your life." Robert hesitated, but nodded gratefully. He sat down slowly, still not fully understanding how everything had changed in such a short time. People around the room whispered softly. Some smiled. One woman in the line quietly wiped her eyes. They had all seen the moment when the world remembered a forgotten hero. As the clerk worked, the general stayed beside Robert. They talked quietly while waiting. "How have you been managing all these years, Sergeant?" Robert gave a tired smile. "I get by, sir. My wife used to handle most of the paperwork. After she passed, I guess I lost track of how to do things like this. I never thought I'd need help." The general nodded slowly. "You shouldn't have had to ask for help. The country should have found you first." Robert chuckled softly. "You're kind, General, but I never served for money. I served because I believed in doing the right thing. The pension just helps with groceries and keeping the lights on." The general looked at him with quiet respect. "It's not charity, Sergeant. It's a debt being paid, one long overdue." The sound of typing continued in the background. Every few seconds, the clerk glanced up nervously, afraid to make another mistake. She called the supervisor, explained the situation quickly, and followed new instructions. Within 30 minutes, the printer behind her started running. A fresh set of papers came out, stamped, approved, and signed. She handed them to the general with shaking hands. "It's done, sir. His pension has been reinstated, effective immediately. The first payment will process this month." The general looked over the documents carefully, then turned toward Robert with a satisfied nod. "There you go, Sergeant. It's official." Robert stared at the papers, his lips trembling. For a moment, he didn't speak. His eyes filled with tears he tried to hide. Finally, he said softly, "Thank you, sir. I don't know what to say." The general smiled warmly. "You don't have to say anything. Just know you're not forgotten." The room was silent again, but this time the silence was full of respect. Even the people waiting in line began clapping softly. Some stood up. The clerk lowered her head in shame, but also relief. Robert stood up slowly and tried to salute, his arms shaking from age and emotion. But before he could finish, the general stopped him and returned the salute first. It was a perfect, sharp military salute, one that came from the heart. The old man's eyes widened, and then he smiled through his tears for a long moment. The two men stood facing each other, one from the past, one from the present, bound by honor that no time could erase. The general finally said softly, "Now, Sergeant, I think you and I should get some lunch. My driver's waiting outside." Robert hesitated. "I wouldn't want to trouble you, sir." "You're not a trouble," the general said with a smile. "You're the reason I'm here." They walked together out of the office. People in the waiting area moved aside to let them pass. Some nodded, others whispered thank you as he went by. The janitor stood near the door, smiling proudly. The general gave him a small nod of gratitude, a silent thank you for making the call. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the clouds were breaking apart. The sunlight peeked through, warm and golden. The general opened the car door for Robert himself, something that made the old man protest quietly. But the general insisted. As they drove through the quiet streets, Robert looked out the window, still holding the approved papers in his lap. He couldn't stop smiling. For the first time in years, he felt seen, respected, and valued again. The general glanced at him and said softly, "You know, my father always said courage isn't about medals or rank. It's about standing up when nobody's watching. He told me you taught him that." Robert's eyes glistened. "Your father was a good man. I just did my duty." "He said you saved him and 12 others that night," the general said quietly. "They were surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of hope. You carried him out even after being wounded yourself." Robert smiled faintly. "He remembered that?" "He never forgot," the general replied. "He talked about you every year on Veterans Day, said the world may forget names, but honor never fades." Robert turned his face toward the window again, blinking away tears. "Your father was right," he whispered. The car stopped in front of a small family diner. The general and Robert went inside. The waitress, a kind-looking woman, smiled when she saw the uniform and the old jacket. She led them to a table by the window. "What can I get you gentlemen?" she asked cheerfully. Robert looked embarrassed. Just coffee for me, please. The general shook his head. Make that to full meals, he said kindly. And some pie. When the food came, Robert stared at the steaming plate for a moment before picking up his fork. I haven't had a meal like this in a while, he admitted. Then enjoy it, the general said with a grin. You've earned every bite. They ate slowly, talking about old times, the people they'd known, the changes over the years. The general listened more than he spoke. Robert told stories of loyalty, friendship, and small moments of kindness that had kept him going through the darkest days. When they finished eating, the general reached into his pocket and handed Robert a small envelope. This is my personal number. If you ever need anything, call me directly. No forms, no lines. Robert looked down at it, his eyes full of gratitude. You've already done more than enough, sir. The general shook his head. No, it's the least I can do. You gave my family generations of life. I'm just returning the favor. As they stood to leave, the general reached out and gave Robert a firm hug. You're a hero, Sergeant. Don't ever forget that. Robert's voice cracked as he said, Thank you, sir, for remembering. When they stepped outside, the sun was shining fully now. The wet streets glistened, and the air smelled fresh.